In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. We thank you, Lord, for this day, this opportunity to come and to study your servant David and all the different events of his life, the highs and the lows and the challenges. And he was not perfect, but he remained faithful. Help us to continue to see that in these final events of his life, and help us to all take home different points from your servant David, and to see it in our own lives through the intercessions of all your saints who have pleased you from the beginning. Hear us as we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. All right, so we are going to conclude our study on the life of David. And last week we took let me quickly touch on the last 2 weeks actually. So 2 weeks ago we studied the fall of David with Bathsheba. And one of the things that we highlighted there was what Nathan the prophet, when he came and set David straight, he said that the sword will not depart from your house, which was one of the consequences of his fall with Bathsheba. And what we saw in immediately the next chapter was that's exactly what happened, that the sword came into David's house, and it came through this pretty bad interaction between Amnon, which is one of David's sons, and Amnon's stepsister, Tamar. And to make a long story short, Amnon rapes Tamar, and Tamar's full brother, which is Absalom, 2 years later takes revenge on Amnon, killing Amnon, and then he runs. Not sure what David will do to him. He runs. Well, he stays out for 2 years, and then eventually he's brought back in because Joab, who is David's commander of the army, notices that David is affected by Absalom's absence. Right, so David isn't dealing with his Absalom. So Joab, contrives a plan to bring Absalom back. He comes back. David doesn't see him for a while until Absalom lights Joab's crops on fire, which gets Joab's attention. And then he eventually orchestrates a meeting between him and David kisses him as a sign of like acceptance back. But Absalom begins to utilize his newfound grace in the eyes of David to conjure up support with the Israelites, and he eventually gains enough support from the Israelites to where he essentially throws a coup. He plans for a coup, and he overthrows David, and David picks up on this. And where we left off last week was David was leaving Jerusalem and essentially fleeing for his life. And in this flight, he was met on the hill by Zadok the priest and his two sons, and they were carrying the ark. And there was a very, very interesting exchange between David and Zadok the priest, where he was saying, just take the ark back, because whether I have the ark or not, God is going to judge me, and he is going to do what he wants. So I'm not fooling God by taking the ark, because the ark, whenever its symbolism was seen when Israel would go out to battle, they would take the ark, and it was a sign that God was with them and God was going to help them in battle. And so naturally, as David's fleeing, Zadok is like, all right, God is going to help David and essentially restore him. God is on David's side. But David knew he had messed up. He had not dealt with things. The family situation was extremely complex. He was working with a complex family situation, the complexities of being royalty, and then additionally the complexities of the law, which really made it challenging for David to navigate the situation. So David kind of remained silent through a lot of it, even though there are some things he could have done. Remained silent. The situation got out of hand. Absalom overthrew him, and so as David is fleeing for his life, he says, "Just take the ark back. It doesn't matter if I have it or not. God is ultimately going to decide what will come of all this." All right. So that's where we left off. Any quick questions before we continue? And so today we're going to focus on completing this battle between David and Absalom, and to see how it plays out. And then we're going to just touch on one more event at the end of the life of David, to conclude our 8-week study on the life of David. It's been long, but I hope it's been beneficial for everyone. All right. So if there's any questions like now, let me know. If you have questions along the way, please go ahead and just let me know. Share my screen. Okay, so we're going to pick this up where David is continuing to flee. So David is fleeing and he is extremely defeated. And we get a sense of how defeated he is by the description that we have as he's fleeing, right? So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went up. And he had his head covered and went barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up weeping as they went up. Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. All right. So, I mean, a couple just descriptive parts that tell us the condition of David is kings always traveled with an entourage and with the appropriate royal caravan. And right now we have David, who is barefoot and with his head covered. So these are just small details that tell us the amount of disgrace or defeat that David is dealing with right now. And he's doing this openly in front of his people. He's not hiding how he feels. And then to add salt on the wound, right? He just learns that Ahithophel, who is one of his chief advisors, has defected and is now with Absalom. And it's interesting. Like, this is a big thing, because when you're in a situation like this where you're now fleeing for your life because of a coup that has happened, and everything's flipped upside down. The one thing you don't want to know is that your chief advisor, one of your chief advisors, has defected, because they know you. They know how you function. They know what your mind is with respect to battle and how you act in intense situations. But this is where we look at David and we see, like, okay, it just goes from bad to worse and continues to get worse. Like, this is how we feel sometimes. Like, we've been in David's shoes. Probably all of us in a different situation, we feel like, things can't get any worse. Next thing, things get worse, right? And just little things just continue to add insult to injury. And we feel like, how on earth am I going to get through this? How am I going to navigate when I feel that the odds are all stacked against me? And all of a sudden, like, when we're in these situations, like, we begin to feel that we're the lowest of the low. Like, any effort that I may be able to put forward just feels completely insufficient and not going to be able to remedy the situation. And that's what David's saying. Like, now David is really reduced, and the only thing he can do is the very last sentence where he says, "Oh Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Right? And I want to stop and just focus on this, because we live in a society that is becoming more and more difficult to navigate, right? We're getting, scenarios thrown at us. Science, is being, really pushed to the envelope, and people are really challenging some of our core beliefs, and the existence of God and morality. We're getting challenged from so many different directions, and sometimes the onslaught of information makes us feel like, lost, and I don't know how to navigate this, right? The information out there is so voluminous that it becomes overwhelming, and it seems like the wisdom of the world, quote unquote wisdom of the world, seems like it's winning out. And the truth is, it's not, right? But people know how to twist wisdom. People know how to twist knowledge and scientific discoveries and different, moral situations that we're facing. People know how to twist it well and make us feel insignificant. But the reality is that, like, we don't have anything to fear from these situations because we are fortified and backed by God Himself. But our emotions can get the best of us in heated situations, right? In difficult situations. And I want to point to a beautiful part in Vespers. We have it in Vespers and Matins, and and sadly, even like, I'm guilty of this. It There's a reference to Ahithophel in our Vespers and Matins, and it's included in one of the litanies, and unfortunately, these litanies are more frequently than not are read silently while the gospel is being chanted. And so it's not said out loud, but it's a beautiful section that is incorporated into the life of prayer of the church, that reminds us that God is not going to be defeated by, quote unquote, the wisdom of this world. And so I want to read this part in Vespers, and it comes from the Litany of the Assemblies. All right, it's the last litany that we pray in Vespers and Matins, where it says, "The enemies of your holy church, O Lord, as at all times, now also humiliate. Strip their vanity, show them their weakness speedily. Bring to naught their envies, their intrigues, their madness, their wickedness, and their slander, which they commit against us. O Lord, bring them all to no avail. Disperse their counsels, O God, who disperse the counsels of Ahithophel." All right, so it's a beautiful selection, from this litany, that, where the church is in tune with the challenges that we face. And I think sometimes, like, we feel out of sync with the church because of the verbiage or the way it's described. But when you really look at this, these few sentences from this litany of the assemblies, like, it is talking about all the worldly challenges that we face, right? What science is throwing at us, what the medical field is throwing at us, the morally complicated and challenging situations we're finding ourselves in, right? With abortion, that is just becoming so difficult to deal with, and all around us. Situations with, dealing with members of the LGBT community, dealing with scientific discoveries. It feels overwhelming, right? And sometimes it all just piles on one after the other. But we're reminded that, we need to be faithful in our prayers, knowing that God is always going to support us through these difficult situations. And He will disperse their counsels, and He will, show them their faults. So it's just a beautiful thing that connection that I wanted us to that I wanted to make tonight. But moving forward, when we look at David, we see that David is at his lowest. And there's a lot of reasons for God to really punish David. And there is a punishment. He's dealing with a punishment. Like, he is dealing with the consequences of his behavior stemming all the way back to Bathsheba, right? But despite the chastisement, there is always love in the chastisement that God gives us, right? David is reaping of his consequences. He's quite possibly feeling rejected by God. But despite the superficial emotions of feeling rejected by God in the moment, David knows that God is faithful. And so, as he gets his bad news about Ahithophel joining Absalom, he gets eventually to the top of the hill, and we begin to see, a season of like little like seasons of love, or like, if you will, like breaks in the cloud where the sun comes shining through in this ascent up the mountain, where David at the top of the hill is met by one of his trusted advisors, who's Hushai, and he gives him some information on what's happening, and Hushai is like ready to follow him, and David says like, no, I want you to stay in Jerusalem because you're going to be of more help. And if we're going to defeat Ahithophel, I'm going to need you on the ground. And so there becomes like a little flicker of hope that David sees, as he's ascending to the mountain. And here's a couple verses that capture that. And it says, now it happened when David had come to the top of the mountain where he worshiped God. There was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. And David said to him, if you go with me, then you'll become a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant previously, so I will now also be your servant, then you may defeat the counsels of Ahithophel. All right. So David catches a little break, right? There's a little, hope that is coming together. And Hushai complies with David's request. And he eventually goes back and he convinces Absalom that he's going to be loyal to whoever sits on the throne. And just as he served his, Absalom's father, which is David, he will also serve David's son. So to Hushai conveying this message to Absalom, he's like, I respect the throne. I respect who's on the throne, and having you there is essentially like having your father David, because you're the oldest son. All right. So Hushai goes back into the city, and at the time he's going into the city, Absalom also is coming into the city. And just to make sure we're on the same page, Absalom first declared himself king in Hebron. Which was really advantageous, because if you really go back even further, David spent the first 7 years of his kingdom, of his reign as the king of all Israel. He started in Hebron. So being there for 7 years, he had kind of established it as like a capital of sorts. So there's a wall, there's resources, there's buildings. So it was advantageous for Absalom to start there, because it was already set up. But now Absalom wanted all of Israel, so he moved in to Jerusalem, which was the full capital. All right. And along the way, not only does David get the help of Hushai, but Ziba, who is the servant of Mephibosheth, who is the son of Jonathan, his best friend before Jonathan passed, meets him at the top of the hill, and he brings him a whole bunch of resources and replenishments for the battle, or for the journey. So David is being supported, and the kindness that David had shown throughout his reign as king up to this point to a variety of different people, it shows up, because when he is running and really at the lowest point, like, people show up out of nowhere. And it's such a nice reminder to us to remember that, acts of kindness that we sow with people, like, show up in the times and from individuals that we least expect. And David is being supported in small ways, which is the love of God coming through the chastisement that he is giving David, right? And it's important for us to see this, because we tend to think of God in very like black and white. I'm on God's good side, he shows me love. I'm on like his bad side, like he's going to chastise me and there's going to be no love. No, like, God is like love at all the time. When he is punishing appropriately, and he's always offering up like bits of love, um, to get us through it. He's never going to punish us beyond our ability or capacity to take it. He's always going to shower us with little bits of love here and there. So we see this whole thing transpire, right? And and then when we kind of focus our attention back to Jerusalem, we have Absalom who has come in and he's kind of getting settled in, and David is now on the run. And I'll show you a map a little bit later to show you where David is going and how far actually David runs away from Jerusalem. But you have Hushai there, and you have
Why is he on the run? Because his son took over?
Yeah, so Absalom came in and he overthrew David essentially. So there's a coup happening within the kingdom right now. So David's on the run because he was going to be hunted down by Absalom. So that's why he's running. Make sense?
His son?
What?
His own son overthrew him?
His own son, his eldest son, Absalom.
Why? His son hated him or something?
His son was, last week, his son murdered another son. Absalom murdered Amnon, but Amnon was the one who raped Tamar, who was Absalom's sister. And so there's a whole bunch of family drama going on, to put it bluntly, and Absalom is also, pining for the kingdom. He's the oldest son, and so he's also trying to make a run at the kingdom, but he's doing it in an kind of a nasty way and a deceitful way, and he kind of works
in aggressive fashion.
Yeah, aggressive, and he's being very methodical about it as well. But last week and it's recorded, we kind of have all the details as to how we got to this point. Sound good?
Sounds amazing.
All right, let's keep on going. So right now we're in Jerusalem and Absalom is getting settled, and Absalom wants advice on how to navigate the situation. And so here comes the battle of advice between Ahithophel and Hushai. And so I'll read the advice, and then I want to hear from you guys to just kind of get like your impression on like good advice, not good advice. All right. So we are in 2 Samuel 16, verses 20 through, we're going to read 20 through 23. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give advice as to what we should do." And Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go in to your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father. Then the hands of all who are with you will be strong." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the top of the house, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now the advice of Ahithophel, which he had given all those days, was as if one had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. That was part of it. I'm going to continue on, because here's the continuation of his advice. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Now let me choose 12,000 men, and I will rise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and weak, and make him afraid. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike only the king. Then I will bring back all the people to you. Then when all return except the man whom you seek, all the people will be at peace." And the saying pleased Absalom and all the leaders of Israel. So if you were like, having studied David and having kind of more intimate knowledge of David, what would you think of this advice of Ahithophel towards Absalom? Like anything stand out to you?
So he was given two different options: first to attack David, and second to go and pretend that David approved him.
No, he was giving so the first part of the advice was he's telling Absalom essentially like make yourself a stronger enemy with David by sleeping with his concubines who are left, right? So that was the first part, and then the other part is he's essentially saying like, give me 12,000 men, and I'm going to hunt David tonight and go after him because he's on the run, right? So this is definitely a weak point for anybody who's on the run. And I'm only going to strike down the king, and then anybody who else is with David, I'm going to reconcile them to you, and therefore you're going to have the entire kingdom. So that's a summary of the advice of Ahithophel.
Oh, so either sleep with his concubines or attack David. Well, they both seem like pretty bad options.
Well, I mean, it wasn't. I don't think it's an either or. It's like do this and then do that. Sleep with the concubines, then give me 12,000 troops.
Probably not, because takeovers, especially more violent ones, should be smooth transitions if you want approval from the people. No one wants a dictator that immediately shows violent, um, uneasy tendencies. It's imprudent. If we look over history and see how dictators take over, they usually tend to show their more violent, uneasy sides many years after taking over. Because you want to slowly gain the people's trust, and then you can transition your image when you have your hand fully on power. So probably not.
Interesting point. I think we're gonna touch on that point, going forward, because Hushai, we're about to hear from Hushai, and he actually takes your approach. But the one thing like that stands out to me with respect to this is like, actually I'm going to save it because I think Hushai covers it. All right. So this is what Ahithophel suggests to Absalom, and then Absalom wants to hear from Hushai. All right, so here's Hushai's advice. So Hushai said to Absalom, the advice that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time. For, said Hushai, you know your father and his men, that they are mighty men, and they are enraged in their minds like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. And your father is a man of war and will not camp with the people. Surely by now he is hidden in some pit or in some other place. And it will be when some of them are overthrown at the first, that whoever hears it will say, there is a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. And even he who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt completely. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. So, just looking at this advice, like Hushai hit it right on. Like he knew the type of man that David was, right? David was crafty. He was a warrior. He had proven himself time and time again. He escaped Saul, after two big, hunts, pursuit that Saul made for David. David escaped both of them. David knows how to be on the run, right? He is a trained soldier in addition to being a king, right? And the men who are with him, they've been on the run with him. So like they have this. Absalom is still like young. He's a novice. We don't get a sense that he's gone out to battle. He knows how to, he's not strategically minded with respect to his military skills. So he'd be in trouble hunting after David. But to the point that was made earlier, let's look at Hushai's advice a little bit closer. It says, therefore I advise that all Israel be fully gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba. So Dan was the very top, and Beersheba was at the bottom of the kingdom of Israel. Right? So let all Israel be fully gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba, like the sand that is by the sea for a multitude. and that you go to battle in person. So we will come upon him in some place where he may be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him, there shall not be left so much as one. Moreover, if he has withdrawn into a city, then all Israel shall bring ropes to the city, and we will pull it into the river, until there is not one small stone found there. So Absalom and all his men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than the advice of Ahithophel, for the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster upon Absalom. Right? So Hushai takes, Jeremiah's advice, or shares similar advice, where he's like, just slow down, gather the whole kingdom together, bring them, let them be as one, let them acknowledge you as the king, and when that has happened, then, like anything you say, like the kingdom will follow. You'll have so many soldiers that David isn't going to be able to, just escape, through the seams or hide somewhere. And even if he hides in the city, you have enough soldiers to go to that city and essentially destroy it with David in it, right? And this is found to be appeasing to Absalom. And Absalom essentially decides to go and side with the advice of Hushai. All the while, Hushai is buying time for David, right? So he's kind of setting David up to go and establish himself and get prepared. He knows a fight is coming. He knows a fight is inevitable. But Hushai is just like, if I just gave David a little bit of time, he's going to figure this out, right? He's going to put himself in a good situation.
Why is Hushai working on David's side?
Because Hushai is another one of David's advisors, but he remained loyal. Ahithophel was an advisor, but he defected to Absalom. Hushai, as we were saying earlier, he met David. He said, I'm going to go with you. And David said, nope, go to Jerusalem. You'll be more useful there. Right? So Hushai is secretly working for David.
Oh, okay, I see. That makes sense.
Gotcha. All right. So upon Hushai hearing from Absalom that, okay, he's going with his advice, he then communicates with Zadok the priest and his two sons, who are also two, covert operatives on David's side. And they kind of have this chain of communication, through the three of them, that they figure out how to get messages to David. And so, while this message is being leaked back to David, Ahithophel is just feeling his pride is shot. He's feeling horrible that he wasn't listened to. He goes home and he hangs himself, right? And that's the last that we hear of Ahithophel. And so the wisdom of Ahithophel is defeated. So
why did he hang himself?
He hung himself because his advice wasn't taken. So he was humiliated by Hushai in front of Absalom. And so he lost his standing and his trust among the elders and Absalom of this new regime. And so he ended his life because his advice wasn't listened to. Not the best thing to do, but that's what he did. All right. I know this map is tiny, but I want to give a little bit of reference point to what's happening. So Jerusalem isn't on this map, but we know that Jerusalem is always next to Bethlehem. So here's Bethlehem, and so Jerusalem is right around in this area. Now, what we learn from scripture is that David runs to Mahanaim, and Mahanaim is over here. So you can see, like, this is the trek that David and those who are following him travel. This is not a small distance, right? This is a big, journey that David goes, but it's extremely advantageous for David because in kind of putting this big distance between him and Absalom, it's going to take Absalom a while to figure out essentially where David is, right? Which is going to buy David time. And then David is going to be able to begin to organize those who are with him. And so David begins to, organize the military, and he organizes the military, and he kind of goes with a three-pronged approach where he has three commanders. He breaks up the army into three chunks, and kind of within those three chunks, they have different ranks and so. But he has three commanders, and he's telling them, this is the strategy that we're going to take when we go to fight, and we're essentially going to fight in the forest, right? So they've had time to learn the lay of the land. They're extremely trained, and they know how to battle in rough terrain, whereas Absalom has to travel quite a distance to chase David. And then, even though he may have a greater number of troops, the terrain is going to even the playing field, right? So David is extremely strategic, and he's good at what he does, right? And so David is, he prepped his troops, got everybody set, and then he said, I'm going out with you. But then they respond, and they said, nope, you're going to stay here. And this is the first time that we get a sense that David is told to stay back, that he's not to go out to battle. And this was the response. And they said, but the people answered, you shall not go out. For if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor if half of us die, will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now. For you are now more help to us in the city. Then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Right? So David listens, right? He hadn't listened, he's been stubborn at times, but right now, like, David listens, and he gets this sense of like, all right, I see where they're coming from. If I die as the king, like, then this is all over. Then Israel is really in bad shape because of the intentions of Absalom. If Absalom is
They
really,
have a really good point.
what?
I mean, they have a really good point. If David dies, then it kind of defeats the whole point of the rebellion.
Exactly.
To get this king.
Exactly. If David dies, like, what they're doing goes to waste. And also,
And
like,
a huge power vacuum.
yeah, and Absalom, like, for the way he's taking over the kingdom, is not shaping out to be a good king. Also, like, he wasn't anointed. The king
More
is,
so a dictator.
yeah, he's more of a dictator. But David was anointed. He is the king, and God hasn't made it clear that he is moving on from David. All right. And so David realizes this is the best thing. He hangs back, but he sends him out with this request, right? Which is an interesting request, which is where, like, we always say that David experiences the whole spectrum of emotions, and we have the whole spectrum of emotions captured for us in the Psalms, but we also see it, like, right here in these verses, in this verse where he says, now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard the king, gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. So even though, like, David chased out of Jerusalem, chased all the way out to Mahanaim, and running for his life, he wants to show mercy to Absalom, it just wasn't the way that life happened back then. Like, if you were a king and your kingdom was being threatened, you weren't looking to show mercy to the king, to whoever's threatening you. But David here is just, he's caught in this whirlwind of emotions, and he's not sure exactly how to navigate it. And so he tells him, like, okay, be kind to Absalom. Just bring him in. We'll question him, right? I'll show him mercy. And it's a confusing message that he conveys to his troops and to the people who are following. Like, we're on the run because of this guy, and you want to bring them in, like, carefully and peacefully. Like, so the message is very confusing, and it doesn't sit well with his commanders. So as they finally, go into battle, David's army and Absalom's army, then Joab, or sorry, Absalom and his men start to lose the battle, and the tides are shifting towards David and his men, and they're doing well, and eventually Absalom begins to retreat. The, the way it's described is that he's riding a mule, and why he's riding as a king, riding a mule is a bit puzzling. But as he's running, just to show you how much of a novice he is in battle, as he's running, he gets his head stuck in a tall tree branch while running on the mule, and the mule continues to run. And so somebody says, like, hey, by the way, I just saw Absalom. He's hanging from a tree, and he's suspended. Like, and so Joab, who is the main commander of the army, starts to talk to this individual who says, oh, I just saw Absalom, he's hanging. And he says, here's a picture of it, right? Of Absalom hanging from the tree, by his hair here, but who knows what it really was. But this is Joab's response. Now,
So
certainly,
when they say he's hanging by a tree, that means he hung himself with a noose.
no, like he was as he was trying to escape on his mule, he was tall, sitting on the mule, and as they went under a tree, his head got stuck in the tree. And the mule kept on running, so he was hanging from the tree, but not dead.
Oh, so he was literally hanging from a tree.
Literally hanging from the tree. All right. Now, a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him? And why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Itaiah, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. So this young man, was terrified to touch him, even though everybody's in agreement. It's kind of the elephant in the room that everybody should kill Absalom, but there's this confusing message from the king. And the king, King David, has been known that anybody who comes to tell him that so and so is dead, and David didn't want him dead, that person ends up dying. So this man is like, I'm not telling David that I killed his son, because that means I'm done, right? And this is what he finishes off, and he says, otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. Then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. Right? So Joab's not going to mess around, and Joab goes and kills him. Because to Joab, he's got his head on straight. And he's like, we've been on the run. Our lives and our families have been, at risk. And David wants us to keep this young man alive. He's deceitful, he's manipulative, and if he overthrew us once, he can overthrow us again. I'm not going to do it. So he kills him, and then eventually word, seeps back to David.
Did he kill the soldier or the son?
He killed Absalom, who was David's
The soldier who refused to kill the son?
No. He didn't kill the soldier. He just killed Absalom, who was David.
Oh, he killed David's son. Okay. I thought he killed the soldier who refused to kill the son for his disobedience.
He just had this, going back and forth. He's like, I'm done wasting my time talking about this. I'm going to go kill Absalom. Right? And so David catches wind, and this is David's response. Right? Then the king was deeply moved and wept, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. So we're still in Mahanaim. We haven't moved back to Jerusalem yet. And so he went up and wept over the gate. And as he wept, he thus says, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, And Joab was told, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard it said that day, the king is grieved for his son. So again, like David just doesn't seem to be in his right mind. And even though like they won the battle and it came at the cost of his son, right? We don't get a sense that he mourned this much when Amnon died or Tamar was raped. But for some reason with Absalom, he's just excessively mourning, and it's stealing kind of that joy of victory from those who are running with him, and so people aren't sure what to make of this. They don't know, like, okay, do we celebrate? We can go back home, like the enemy's been defeated, but the king is sad. Like David is really throwing them for a curveball, and so they're not sure what to do until Joab finally says, again, I've had enough of this. And so David, or Joab comes into David, and he says, then Joab came into the house to the king and said, today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither prince nor servant. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you very well. So we know that Joab has a lot of stock with David if he's going to talk to the king like this. We're just saying, like, dry up your tears, stop being a baby, and celebrate, because we just risked our lives for you to save you, your family, your children, your concubines, and all you can do is grieve over Absalom. So Joab gives him a stern warning. And the warning continues. And he says, now therefore, arise, go out and speak comfort to your servants. Like, give them a word of encouragement. Don't sit here and cry about Absalom when everybody has, done this. Go and speak to them. Be a leader. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night. And that will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now. Then the king arose and sat in the gate, and they told all the people, saying, there is the king sitting at the gate. So all the people came before the king, for everyone of Israel had fled to his tent. All right, so David gets some sense knocked into him from Joab, and he responds. And it's important, like, that, especially in times where, like, we have a mix of emotions, right? We need to be able to hear people who have tough but good advice. And Joab's advice represents that. His advice is tough. He's not throwing a pity party for David, right? He's not going to let David cry, because if he continues to cry and mourn Absalom, nobody's going to want to fight for him. Nobody wants to follow him as a king, because at this point, if he just continues to cry for Absalom, then who in their right mind would say, oh yeah, I want to follow a king who cries when the enemy dies, right? It doesn't make sense. And I understand this is his son, but the relationship changed to an irreconcilable, situation when Absalom turned his back and pursued after David. So Joab gives hard advice, but it's sound advice. And David receives it, and he responds. He may not have liked it, but he does respond. There are people in our lives who give us hard advice, but it's good advice. And
Is this one of those cases?
Yeah, I mean, what Joab is doing with David is he's giving hard advice, but this is good advice. And David is just, he's wallowing in his emotions. And we can't allow our wallowing in emotions to, prevent us from hearing sound advice. even when we're struggling to navigate, like, and somebody gives us sound advice, but it's not necessarily what we want to hear. We have to grow in our maturity and gain composure of our emotions in order to hear the advice. Because what he's saying, like, what is to come if you don't heed my advice is going to be worse than running from Absalom. And likewise too, like when we get sound advice in the midst of really difficult situations in life, if we don't pull ourselves together and ask God to give us strength, right, and to respond to this advice, a lot of times, like, we will build up a worse situation for ourselves long term than the actual situation, right? There have been families who lost a son or daughter or important member of the family or love family of the member, but can't pull themselves out of the grief that they're experiencing, despite like advice or despite even counseling. It's like the will to respond gets zapped out of them and they just wallow. And what it does is it can tear a family apart, right? You can be a student and like you have a really bad semester and you want to like throw in the towel and you come down on yourself and your parent or trusted one gives you good advice and says like, wake up, pull yourself together, get back out there, right? It becomes a make it or break it moment in that student's life. And if they don't like pull themselves out and get their head on straight and go back to school, like it can be a very, very bad trajectory. And they're going to end up, trying to recover for years upon years, from that tailspin. And so all of us have, things that throw us into an emotional world. But we have to be able to identify it. And when sound advice comes, we need to challenge ourselves to respond to that advice, right? And David responded, and it began to turn the kingdom. And he would go on for many years to rule as the king over Israel, and kind of reunite all of Israel under himself again. But it was because of Joab. And we all need a Joab in life. Sometimes Joab is our parents, sometimes Joab is a friend, sometimes Joab is a priest, but everybody needs a Joab. Everybody needs to hear tough advice. So I want you to think to yourself, who is your Joab?
Killed his son, right?
What?
Joab killed his son, right?
Joab killed his son. Yes. Everybody needs a Joab. Everybody needs, hard words from time to time, and we need to respond to it. All right. I'm going to take us to the very end of David's life, and this is what we're going to close on. So this is the last act of David's life. And in the last act of David's life, he was nearing the end, and he came up with this idea to say, I want to do a census because I want to see how big the kingdom is. I want to know, like, okay, how have we grown? Are we a mighty kingdom? Where are we at? So he wants to get a sense of like his kingdom. And so the one to carry out a census is the military. And so Joab, being the commander of the military, is the one who would have to carry out this task that David wants of a census. And Joab tries to say like, hey, like, you've done good. The kingdom is great. Like, we're in a time of peace. Like, no need to do this. No need to do this. God has blessed you. But David insists. And so for the next 9 months, Joab is out there going from town to town to town to town to town, collecting the names and stuff like that, until he comes back and he says, like, this is, the kingdom is big. I think the number is 800,000. All right. And so after David hears the number from the census, all right, he's convicted that what he did was wrong. And we read this in verse 10. He says, and David's heart condemned him after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now I pray, O Lord, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. So the Lord hears his prayer, And he's like, yep, you messed up again, but I got a prophet. His name is Gad. I'm going to send them to you. And so Gad the prophet comes to David to help David reconcile. And so these are the options that the prophet Gad gives David. He says, now when David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, a prophet was also another word for a prophet that you'll come in the Old Testament is a seer. It says, go and tell David, thus says the Lord, I offer you three things. Choose one of them for yourself, that I may do it to you. So Gad came to David and told him, and he said to him, shall 7 years of famine come to you in your land? Or shall you flee 3 months before your enemies while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days plague in your land? Now consider and see what answer I should take.
3 days of what?
3 days of a plague. 3 days of.
That doesn't sound that bad. It's only 3 days.
Huh?
I mean, 3 days doesn't sound that bad.
3 days doesn't sound that bad. I agree. And that's ultimately what David chooses. But he chooses it for an interesting reason, right? He says, and David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Please let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. So David essentially chooses the 3 days of the plague because he's been down this road with God. And he's been through the gauntlet in life. And what David doesn't want to do is he doesn't want to be on the run anymore because enough. I've had enough madmen chasing me. Right? The famine, just 7 years doesn't sound great. 3 days, okay, it's short, sweet, but he wants to be in the hands of God. And that's it, it's such, even though David just made a mistake, there's a degree of maturity to say, okay, I made a mistake, but I'd rather be in the hands of God. I want God to ultimately be in control, and in his control, he can chastise, he can show love, he can show mercy, he can do it all. I just want to be in his hands. And so David, chooses this. He loses 70,000 men or men and women within his kingdom because of this plague. But the cost of leadership is high. And it's important for any one of us, to think as a leader in our own right, our decisions have that trickle down effect. When we make bad decisions, it's people below us that really suffer. So 70,000 people died of his kingdom. Right? And this was one of the closing, acts, the last thing that we're going to meditate on with respect to David. And I'm just going to share some last closing thoughts about David, that he was known as a man after God's own heart. David's pursuit of God was far from perfect, right? David's pursuit was laced with controversy, bad decisions, consequences, great highs, going into Jerusalem, bringing the temple, bringing the ark into Jerusalem, and lows, running from your son, right? He experienced the spectrum, falling with Bathsheba, lying about Uriah the Hittite. It was a spectrum of life. And it's so important for us to highlight that, because this was the man described as pursuing after God's own heart. And I say that because he was far from perfect, but he was beloved by God. And this is what the road looks like for somebody who's pursuing after God. It is mistake after trouble, after bad situation, good time, bad time. That's what life is. And this is why David, while he is a king, is extremely relatable to all of us, right? Complex family situations, not knowing what to do about his son, having one son rape another son, the complexities of his life are far and wide. But through it all, he pursued after God, right? Not perfectly, but faithfully. And that's what I want everybody to take. Final take-home message is that we need to pursue after God faithfully. And that includes the entirety of the mistakes that we will commit in life. And knowing that God will correct us, he will be faithful, he will be loving, and he will always be working to bring us back. But we also have to respond to that. We also have to kind of turn our mind and our attention to him. That we need to not make light of the mistakes that we've made, but we need to see them and leverage them to as a corrective force back to God. So I hope we see that in David, but more importantly, like we see it in our own lives.